Consider and react to a statement made by a professional therapist. Whoa. The professional therapist said, we serve MAPs based on a foundation of prevention. So I want you guys to just talk about how you feel about that statement, whether you think that's a good statement, a bad statement, how that makes you feel. Well, yeah, partially if you agree with it, what inherent problems it might have. What's that?
That's not necessarily what they're preventing. Yeah.
No, in some ways, he's saying based on prevention, it presumes that you're going to stop somebody from being an MAP. How would you know they're an MAP?
When they told you they're an MSP, they're trying to stop
This is presenting the person's funds to you as a person. And I guess some identifies himself as
I like moving the little boys. Okay, what should I do?
Give you about 2 more minutes. Yeah, I don't know why I thought those were going to be big enough.
getting into our current here helps. Definitely helps.
They had no idea. How would you do this? First time I meet you, get me a therapist. Do you ever and you're sitting on a computer and you put my name in, and Google comes up, and there I am, fabulous registration process. That's what he did.
'Okay, let's bring it in a little bit. What's that? Oh, okay. Sorry. Guess I got told.
They have a bigger table. They've got more people discussing.
More discussion, right?
1 presenter, 0 for the crowd. So I guess I have to move the highlights. Is that the story?
Yeah.
"30 seconds. So can we have somebody from each table kind of give us a little report about what you discussed?
Yeah, sure. I think we had too many people and not enough time.
Well, you're welcome to carry on the discussion later. So big table, what did you decide in question one?
We just got through an introduction.
He was real brief, don't blame him.
What makes a good therapist? Anybody? This therapist?
I'm not there. Please tell me there's another therapist in this room. Yes. Oh, good.
Okay. What makes a good therapist?
Somebody who is willing to meet their client where they're at without judgment.
Meet their client where they're at without judgment. What else?
Comes recommended and has experience in the subject.
Recommended and has experience in the subject? Anybody else?
They can listen and help the client mitigate the risk of exposure.
Help the client, they can listen and help the client mitigate the risk of exposure. Okay? Compassion. Anybody else?
Therapist is supposed to be a professional caregiver, so I would say gives appropriate care relevant to the needs of the client.
All right. So, go on.
They are also somebody who does not dictate to the person, but helps the individual find their own solutions.
Find their own solutions, right? I don't think so. Yeah. So do we think that every MAP comes to a therapist just to talk about MAP issues?
No way.
So should that be the main focus?
Not
It's the person.
Check, 1, 2.
It's a legalistic modus operandi.
Okay.
It's because professional liability, right? That's where that comes from.
Right, right. So what else do we think about this? We serve MAPs based on a foundation of prevention.
I think the foundation is the person and their well-being, not society's well-being.
Right? What was that?
I think it sounds like by prevention that they're going to put their name somewhere or inform somebody just in case something happens, you know.
Right? What else?
It is presumptive. So it's putting the horse cart before the horse.
Uh-huh.
Because, I can talk without it, trust me.
But they can't hear it. She's saying it's presumptive.
It's very presumptive. It is putting the cart before the horse. Because if you're going from a preventive standpoint, that has to be done in a much more general sense.
Okay?
Because if you want to work with an individual trying to prevent something that has not occurred, you have to know it's going to occur.
Okay? Anybody else have anything on that? I have an undergraduate degree in social work, and my first year in college, I had a professor who I thought was a little bit nuts at the time, but I've since come to appreciate the statement that she made in my first year of college, and that was, if you're working with a woman of ill repute, it's not your job to change her, but to make her the best woman of ill repute she can possibly be. What do we think about that?
I love it.
No, it's very true. And because you can't change the person. You cannot change somebody, only they can change themselves. They have to take the actions. What you're doing is helping them find the actions to make the changes and support them through encouragement, skills, and so forth.
and the changes that they want to make, not the changes that you want to make, right? And so if a person is focused on prevention, is the person in front of you actually your client, or is somebody else your client? What does prevention mean? We look up the dictionary definition of prevention. It's an act of preventing or hindering, to keep something from happening or to stop somebody from doing something, right? And then if we look at the definition of therapy, therapy is intended to relieve or heal a disorder. How can you hinder somebody from doing something and relieve a disorder at the same time?
This is my own field, so it's kind of. Not this time. The fact is that prevention means something has already occurred. You can't be a therapist to prevent something. It doesn't happen. It doesn't work that way. As a therapist, your job is to help somebody learn skills to work forward and to learn how to work through what is going on, not prevent what's going to happen.
Yeah. You know, in our list of when we get requests for therapists from our referral service, a lot of these guys or girls come to us and they want help in figuring out how to deal with the social stigma. It's not really, most of these people have never offended and they're not planning to offend. It's dealing with everything around them or dealing with not being able to find a way to ever feel like you can enter into a satisfying relationship with somebody. So how do you work through that if somebody's looking at you and thinking they have to stop you from doing something to protect society? That's not the job of a therapist. Can you imagine going into a therapist for any other reason and them saying, whoa, I got to stop you from, drinking, or I got to stop you from whatever, I got to stop you from getting divorced, or, whatever. That's really not compatible. The two just don't mix. Other thoughts?
Well, I was kind of on the last question. If you came to the therapist because you were worried that you might act out, if you have these attractions, and I really don't want to do anything about it, I probably won't, but, can you help me so that I won't, or something, then maybe that would be appropriate for the therapist. Right. But maybe people know, maybe they don't know, maybe they don't have minor attraction, maybe they have OCD or something, and they're just worried that there might be minor attracted when they never really would do anything.
Well, that's possible too, and certainly has happened in the past, but, more than anything, they may be comfortable in their own skin, but they're not comfortable with everybody else's skin around them.
It kind of sounds like we're talking about the mandatory reporting requirements for therapists and care providers, but also in my own experience, I went to court-ordered therapy that was very structured this way, where I was not the client of the treatment providers. The state and the county were the clients of the treatment providers. They were there to supervise and monitor me rather than provide any sort of care. I think the biggest problem in that kind of relationship is that they're not your advocates. You can't trust them, and then that kind of undermines the whole thing, because the expectation is that you be honest and vulnerable, but how can you do that if you don't trust the person you're talking to?
Well, in Indiana, the name of the program that you're talking about is the Sex Offender Management and Maintenance Program. I think that speaks volumes. It's not the let's help sex offenders, it's let's monitor and maintain them, which again implies prevention, right? So yeah, I mean, if your client isn't the client, then number one, you're probably not even interested in giving them help. But number two, how can you give help when your client is obviously a third party? Gil?
It's Alan, right? So Alan brings up a point that's important, at least in my state, and that is I've represented a lot of folks that are MAP that could have been intervened with early on. Ironically, and this is probably an extremely controversial area, I probably have a half a dozen people that I've represented that offended that have told me the same thing, and that is the lack of availability of child pornography led them to offend. That they were doing fine when they were able to access child pornography. It gratified them. They had no interest in hands-on offending. But when that was removed, usually by virtue of a conviction, but sometimes for some other reason, it actually caused them to act on impulses. I represented one young man who was in what they called the SOAR program in North Carolina with modules. And some of the modules I thought were particularly interesting that talked about not just victim empathy and that, but triggering mechanisms in terms of things that you can do that are going to activate your desire to communicate with a minor, which would then lead, because most of my clients are groomers, they're not snatch and grab rapists, and most of them have no prior record. The other problem, and I think Alan mentioned it, that people are reluctant to go to therapists because they don't understand the mandatory reporting law. If you go to a therapist and you say in Florida that you have previously committed a sex offense, they're not required to disclose that, but if you tell a therapist that you offended against John Jones, here's where I did it, this is what I did, and that individual's a minor, then they are required to disclose that. They're not required to disclose anything in terms of future desires that come up in therapy. But it's kind of like the attorney-client privilege. If a client comes to me and says, I'm leaving the office and I'm going to go rob the Wells Fargo bank, that's not privileged. But if he tells me 5 years ago I robbed the Wells Fargo bank, that is.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So, yeah, I mean, that's part of the problem is that there are way too many therapists that are trigger happy to report, and so I guess that brings us to our kind of third point is what questions do you think an MAP would want to ask the therapist before they begin therapy? So one of them, obviously, well, not only do you know the law, but one question that I always ask therapists when we interviewed them is, how do you inform your client of your duty to report, and what things would trigger that for you? Because if I've had therapists that I thought were relatively good say, well, if I don't have a name, if I don't have any identifying information, I really have nothing to report, right? Or, or I help the client phrase something in a hypothetical manner so that we're not, talking about something that I need to report. Or they can say, I fondled a 12-year-old boy 5 years ago, but they don't have to tell you it was Johnny Jones at 41601 North Main Street in, Galveston or whatever, right? So, you want to be able to clarify those things with a therapist, and you want to know that going into it, they're a therapist that has kind of the capacity to deal with those sort of problems. So any other questions that you would ask a therapist or anything? What were you going to say, John?
I wanted to push back a little bit
Sure.
on this prevention discussion. First, I would think that if a therapist helps somebody live with more equanimity in their skin, that they're probably, as a consequence, providing some protection to the community.
Sure.
And so you can't say that the prevention is the goal, but you can say it's a side effect.
Well,
Then there's cognitive behavior therapy, where it seems like the whole goal is to change behavior and not necessarily change the mental orientation behind it.
Right.
And that could certainly look like prevention.
Yeah. And, but hopefully, we're not saying that prevention isn't a worthy goal, but it just shouldn't be the main goal, and hopefully it's the happy stepchild of, doing what you need to do for the client.
Okay. So when therapy was not being provided by local government entities, before that I did actually seek therapy on my own privately. And that, I was fortunate enough to go through an organization called LIRA, which they contracted with my workplace, and I basically told them the issues that I was experiencing, and I did include the attraction to minors in that. And they anonymously reached out to, I think, something like 16 therapists in the area and asked if they would be willing to treat that and what their response to it would be. And they came back with a list of like 4 names of people that they thought I should reach out to. I think having a resource like that, where it puts a divider between you initially, makes that a lot easier, because going up there in person, and even if you're asking hypotheticals, like how would you treat, an adult who's attracted to minors, is a very daunting thing for people to approach, to kind of like out themselves like that, I think.
Which is the reason why we screen them for you, or for whoever, We do pre-screening of the therapist, so that kind of facilitates that thing, or that transition.
Okay, you mentioned, John, about cognitive behavioral therapy. It is not fully what you think it is. Cognitive behavioral therapy is, you have a thought, you act on that thought, then you have an action. But it is a matter of changing the thought process of what happens after you have that thought. What do you do to make a better decision? Or learning how to make that better decision. And it is much more an active part of therapy process than your original, Freudian and so forth, because that's just, you say whatever's on your mind. But it is definitely a proven therapy, but usually most cognitive behavioral therapists also utilize Adlerian and Rogerian and some other formats of therapy within their working process. The other thing that they often will do, even though it was originally designed for people with borderline personality disorder, DBT, which is dialectical behavioral treatment. And it's, again, a means of rethinking what you're doing and teaching you how to learn new processes.
Well, I think, there are multiple different ways, and every therapist has their own modalities that they use. I think just, all of those modalities can be helpful. It's just a matter of your focus should be on addressing the client's needs and how to work through the client's needs, and not you pre-guessing what the client's needs are. Part of what you said earlier made me think that, in Germany, they have a hotline that you can call, and you can get into the Dunkelfeld program or whatever without any sort of judgment or whatever. And those kind of things, if we would do that in this country and open up the possibility without worrying about prosecution, a lot more people would probably take advantage of the program.
Another question I'd have to ask a prospective therapist, unfortunately, is how much is it going to cost? As
Yeah.
I think that's a major restriction in this country.
Yeah, and that's definitely a problem, and I don't have a good answer to you for that, because we don't get into the cost of therapy with therapists, but it would be lovely if we could create some kind of fund that would help people who really can't afford it, and perpetuate that fund. Well, yeah, sometimes yes, sometimes no, but the other problem that I have when I'm referring therapists is I have so few therapists. When you're looking at the worldwide globe, that we serve that, not all of those therapists can work in all areas. Although the PACs that are coming around that are allowing therapists to work in multiple states are certainly helpful, but we're certainly not there yet. But, if I send somebody to a therapist in California when they're in Indiana, they,
Well, part
the,
of the problem, and I'm running into this, and I had a client in Oregon, thank you, Ellen. I have a client in Oregon that had a mental health crisis warrant for him. He got arrested out there. I finally found a therapist to be able to give him a psychosexual risk assessment. Turns out he's incompetent to stand trial. I went through 5 therapists that said, I'm not going to mess with a Florida case because they'll come down on me for practicing in Florida without a license. So a lot of times it's the state's licensure restrictions that prevent them from doing what they would want to do otherwise.
right. I do have a number of therapists that will work as life coaches in other states. But yeah, once you get into actually performing therapy in a particular state, you do need to be licensed.
And national, they are, the ACA. Just to speak to the national licensing point, there's a lot of people, like at the American Counseling Association, they are working on trying to get like interstate compact type situations because national licensing needs to happen for a whole bunch of reasons, but this is a huge one. This, for me, is a big point because I have clients that move right to different states or whatever, and then I have to break that relationship, and that, somebody's 2/3 of the way through treatment and wants to get help, and then they have to find somebody all over again. It causes harm, I think, in the community. Yeah.
So to go back to the original point of this section of things is, are we working for the client or are we not? And we need to make that paradigm shift, but that's difficult for a lot of therapists to make from prevention to client-based thing. And a lot of the MAP organizations out there, you go onto their websites and they're all about prevention, and that really bothers me. I'll get to the in a minute here, but I actually went to Before You Act and said, we need to make a statement on our website that addresses this situation, because I have a lot of therapists and a lot of clients that are coming to me and say, why don't you talk about prevention on your website? And I'm going, well, we're really not about prevention. That's not our main focus. Our focus is on the MAP, which when I talk a little bit about the organization, I'll let you know. But I really like this quote: strong people don't put others down, they lift them up. So here's what a few MAPs had to say. I envision a future where I'm suddenly discovered and people search their memories for when I might have been alone with a child, any child. Telling anyone, even a therapist, feels like a near impossibility given the risks, which I think you addressed earlier, Alan. Another one. I made an appointment with the first therapist available, and he made me feel like shit. If I ever have felt genuinely suicidal in a contemplative sense, it would have been then. He just had no concept that I might be wanting help. It was all just about what a threat I was to children, and about how my feelings were wrong and sick, and I had to stop having them. And one more. After many years, I confided to my therapist about my attraction to kids after his assurances he would not report me. So, it's a big problem trying to find a therapist that isn't going to be judgmental, for sure. Thoughts?
I agree with you, and it's unfortunate because I hear it all the time from people when I tell them what I do for a living, and they say things like, oh my God, I could never do that, I have children. And I'm like, okay, and your point is? But this is other therapists who, it's like they go to school and they learn the code of ethics, and then they get out and they go into practice and they've conveniently forgotten that their job is to work with the client where the client's at and work on the goals that the client wants to work on. It's not about me. And if you show up in that room more than your client, then you're doing them a disservice.
Exactly.
From the client's point of view, it's the original catch-22.
Yeah, for sure. And again, it goes back to Alan's point. I mean, you don't want to seek therapy because you're not sure what the action's going to be. So in terms of before you act, what is before you act? Before you act was established in 2003 by a therapist and a minor attracted person. Before you act is a 501c3 organization run in collaboration between mental health professionals, researchers, and people who are attracted to minors. And I might say that really there's no aspect of the organization that doesn't have a minor attracted person represented in the decision making. So this is the statement that I referred to a minute ago that I asked before you act to put together, which kind of states our purpose without getting into any kind of prevention language. As an alliance of therapists, researchers, and MAPs, Before You Act's mission is to promote a science-informed understanding about people in our communities with an attraction to children or minors and to support them living in truth and dignity. So I thought I'd just kind of briefly outline how we, or what our process is in bringing a therapist on board as a Before You Act signatory therapist. And so we have this page on our website that basically, introduces the program and refers people to a section of the website which I would have liked to have brought on there, but I do think I do have internet access. Let me see if I can pull that up real quick. Simple website name, so easy to find, beforeyouact.org. Oh. Well, that's problematic, isn't it? Okay. Well, I don't know what to do about that. So I guess we'll go back to the slides. Okay, so anyway, there are two sections on the website that we refer therapists at as well as minor attracted persons to, and you can find them by going to the therapy tab and jumping down to principles and perspectives, practice, and a psychotherapy guide. And so we asked them to review those two sections where we outline our philosophy on therapy, and then asked them to write a brief statement about their reaction to that and how their practice would reflect or detract from that statement. And then they submit their resume and that statement to me, and then we schedule a personal interview with those people. So in the interview process, we address some of these things, and ends up being pretty much a free-flow discussion, but we definitely talk about how they became interested in working with MAPs, their experience with MAPs, their therapeutic approaches, any types of MAPs they would not feel comfortable working with, how they inform their clients about reporting laws, what their goal would be in therapy, and again, it goes back to that kind of paradigm shift. And we also, of course, give them an opportunity to ask us any questions that they might have about the organization. So what questions do you have for me?
I have a question. I've been on a registry in 2 states for 30 years for a misdemeanor that I didn't even do, but that's another story. I went to a therapist that was highly recommended by my primary care physician. Oh, he's going to help you. I didn't say what it was about. I just said, I have attention deficit disorder, which I do, and that was my cover. And I went there, and he said, "What's your name? Could you spell it for me, please?" I spelled it. He was on his laptop. He Googled me. And of course, my registration photos from Mecklenburg County popped right up. His face dropped and hit the floor. "Is that you?" He showed me the laptop. I said, "Yeah, that's me. That's why I'm here." His whole demeanor and everything completely changed. And thank God the New Yorker came out in me. I said, "Thank you, Doc. Have a good day. Goodbye." And I walked out. Trying to find somebody, but I want a clarification of what is the legal obligation of the therapist if he thinks you might do something, but you haven't done it yet, as opposed to you already did it. What is he legally obligated to do, if anything?
Well, we got our attorney here, but I think that goes back again to mindset. I mean, that really is the problem, because so much of it is subjective. You know, I mean, it's how you interpret the law, and it's what state you live in, because not all states are created equal in terms of, reporting laws, and some people kind of prefer to err on the side of caution rather on the side of the client. So that's why it's so important to kind of interview your therapist before you engage them, or have somebody like us interview them before you engage them.
Or what you're doing, which is check out, where did they go to school? What's their specialty? Do we have any references on them? Do we have people that have been to them that like them? Pull up the reviews online,
Yeah.
Whatever, and then use your own good judgment. Is that the right, not every doctor is the right doctor.
Right.
You don't go to a dentist for a broken leg,
I mean,
et cetera, et cetera. So you really need to do your homework.
I mean, I'm sure there are very good therapists for OCD, but they may not be a very good therapist for OCD for a minor attracted person, right? Simply because they may not have that was the problem that I had for so many years is, at the time, when I first started looking for a therapist, I was very young, and, the only thing I could relate it to in my mind was homosexuality, which at that time was pretty taboo even of itself. And I went in and talked to this therapist at a high-ranking, I'd gone to a program for children of alcoholics, and this program was a very nationally known program that was highly rated in terms of helping people through alcoholism. And when I approached the therapist about this, his jaw dropped, and he didn't really, it's like he'd never heard of this before in his life, and was like, didn't know what to do and couldn't find anybody to refer me to. And yeah, I mean, they're great therapists for some things, but you're not going to go to a cardiologist for your toe, and that's the same thing here.
Yeah, I had a question, just to clarify. You yourself are a licensed therapist, correct?
No,
No?
I have an undergraduate degree in social work, but I'm not a licensed therapist and couldn't be right now as a registrant.
Okay, yeah, that was actually my question. I thought earlier that you had stated that you were, but I am mistaken on that. I would like some clarification on what exactly are the restrictions, because I know, or I understand that attorneys have a similar restriction where if they had been previously convicted of any sort of serious crime, they would be unlikely to pass ethics when trying to get licensed to practice law. Is there a similar restriction on practicing therapy and care providers?
Well, again, I think it's dependent on the state you're in. There is a therapist, one of our therapists actually, who has multiple degrees in therapy in California, and he is currently not licensed in California because of his conviction, but he has found a pathway through to become licensed, but he still has to complete a number of hours within that, even though he has multiple degrees from other places. So it's dependent on the state, first of all, but it's also, Gil?
It is dependent on the state, and with respect to your question, and therapists run into this as well. You have a code of ethics, okay? And again, you have to be careful if you're talking about a prior event not to give the therapist so much information that it triggers a mandatory report, okay? There's an old ethics case in the law where a murderer, and it's a true case, was a serial killer. And he had buried bodies all over the place. And of course, as you well imagine, the loved ones of those victims wanted to know where their loved ones were so they could give them a proper burial. It got out that this lawyer was told by his client where the bodies were buried, and the question became, did the lawyer have the obligation to disclose that? And the answer was absolutely not, okay? Contrast that with a former president that has a lawyer and he discloses that he intends to violate the law. That former lawyer can and does get subpoenaed to the grand jury and is required to disclose what his client, the former president, told him about his desire to violate the law in the future. So again, if you are conspiring with a lawyer to commit a crime, it's not covered on a privilege, but you can talk about whatever you want to talk about that happened as long as you don't disclose enough specifics to trigger that mandatory report.
Yeah, so that's why you say, I fondled a 13-year-old in 2017, you know, and kind of leave it at that,
Right.
you know. So, yeah. But, yeah, that's, I mean, basically the problem is you have therapists that are trying to interpret the law or don't want to interpret the law, so they get scared and err on the side of caution rather than on the side of the client. Anybody else? Questions, comments, criticisms?
I was just gonna say, there is a resource for therapists, not that there are enough therapists in this room that know this, but you can always call the ACA. If you're a therapist, you can call the ACA. They have like a legal helpline and ask them like questions and like that are hypothetical to find out if you are violating the law, if you do have to make a report or whatever. And people forget that that's a resource, and they do err on the side of caution and make more reports than I think are necessary a lot of the time to cover their own butts when they could have just made a call that was right and gotten that information in advance.
Which is a good resource, but also you may get somebody on there who errs on the side of caution.
Exactly.
So again, it's interpretation to a large degree unless you happen to be talking specifically to an attorney who is familiar with the laws in your particular area.
Yeah, and I have a question about that. Are there any negative consequences for therapists who are too lenient in their interpretation and that make reports when they shouldn't have made reports?
I don't think there's any consequences at all for somebody who makes reports when they shouldn't make reports. Negative consequences would be more on the side of public reaction if public found out that, you know, this person was not reporting things that, you know, whatever. But
So an interesting case that I was reminded of the other day, for those of you that followed the Menendez murder case, the Menendez brothers, Lyle or Eric, one of them went to a therapist and disclosed the gory details of how the two brothers killed their parents. And the therapist was dating a woman who they got into a squabble, and she, wanting her 15 minutes of fame, disclosed the fact that the therapist had told her that there was a confession to the crime. And he was actually called in the second trial of the Menendez brothers as a witness by the state of California to testify, and was allowed to testify as to what Eric Menendez told him in therapy. Talk about a chilling effect.
yeah, for sure. I did want to say, in reaction to your question also earlier, that where you may not be able to be licensed in a particular state, you could work as a life coach. So, you know, if you have life experience in a particular area, you could also work without being licensed.
And I checked the law because in Florida, you can be a convicted felon and be an attorney, but you cannot be a convicted felon and be a legal research assistant. Go figure.
Yeah. welcome to the United States of America, where we're all free. Right?
Michael, a quick question. One of the things I think that's so confusing, and I suffered when I moved from New York to North Carolina. Had I known then what I know now, I wouldn't have done that. But having said that, is there anywhere, any organization that has compiled a master list of all the rules and regulations for every single state? Does such a document exist?
For what subject matter?
The rules and regulations
For
for sex offenders for every state.
I think NARSOL's done that to some degree. There are a couple of organizations that have done that to some degree, but of course, you got to keep the list up to date.
Yeah. Now, and the next, it may not relate to what you're talking about, but the quick question is, I just got hammered. I did not know that a new law had gone into effect last year. I think it's called International Megan's Law. I'm in the travel business. I've been traveling since 1969. I never had an issue. I never had an incident. Okay? I've been on registries since 1993. This is my 30-year anniversary for a misdemeanor. And last year I went to Malta, and I came back, and I made the mistake of not going to New York, but to Charlotte. I got put up against the wall. I got patted down like a criminal. My passport was ripped from my hand. My cell phone was ripped. I was thrown into a room, and then 2 hours later they went through all of my clothing and threw it all over the place. And then she smiled and said, handed me my passport and says, "Have a good day, Mr. Bowden."
Yep.
And I think the problem is that had I known, do they have an obligation to tell us when there's a change in the law?
That's the problem with International Megans, is that the United States sends notices to the country that you're going to travel in, because you have to give a 21-day notice ahead of time, and that country can either reject you or allow you into the country on the spot. Check Paul Rigney's registrantag.org site, which gives a comprehensive matrix about which countries are currently rejecting and which countries have registries.
Just on where the laws are, the NARSOL website does have a wiki for each state. The problem, of course, is you have to check the last time it was updated.
And I think the seminar that was in room 1 earlier today, there's a gentleman that runs a website that he does have a. Oh, there he is. There he is, right there. This guy right here. Check with him. He knows it all.
That's for travel. Domestic travel.
Right, exactly. Well,
Yeah,
I
but
meant,
of course, most of the laws are not about travel. They're about
yeah,
residency restrictions in that state.
too many
and length of
subjects.
time.
We can't even keep track of it, right? Okay, so.
Michael, just a question to you. Given what you put the therapist through and the risks involved in being a therapist in this area, you must have some awfully good people you run into that are willing to go through all this.
I do, and I've had people that won't.
Yeah.
I had one guy reject me, but you know, it's interesting, the higher professional they are, the more respected they are. I had this therapist we interviewed earlier this week, and he was like, "I'm so glad you guys are doing this. I wish other people did that." So, you know, I mean, we don't want them all anyway. We only want the ones that are willing to be part of the team. So I just want to take a couple minutes and kind of review some of the other resources that that Before You Act offers. One of which is we do a workshop at least once a year, generally in April in the Baltimore area. There have been 11 clinical workshops since 2008. Not highly attended, but we're getting there. We also work with a group that does some education for therapists who work with MAPs, the signatory therapist list. Since 2007, we've made over 300 referrals, average of about 12 a month in countries. We have therapists in multiple countries around the world, but we've also gotten requests from people around the world. We also have a research group and a colloquium, which meets and discusses different aspects of research and is pretty represented by people in multiple countries around the world. We have a journal that reviews research done and also a colloquium that meets as a part of that. We have a number of support groups, including a support group for family and friends, and actually Brenda Jones talked with our education director at our workshop in April, and we're hoping to kind of roll out the Fearless program in this context. And then we do some public outreach as well. So a lot of different, and I think I missed a slide that we do have the support group for MAPs. That's a peer support group. There's also, I did a podcast interview with a guy named Elliot who runs this website, which is quite terrific. He covers a number of different aspects of the subject, and so I did do a podcast with him about finding therapists, so you might want to check it out. It's episode E2S1, I believe, on the podcast. The website is Maps Journey, something or other, mapsjourneypodcast.com. So that's pretty terrific as well. Any other questions?
Yeah, can you give us that slide that has your website for the very first one, the before you? I didn't.
It's just the B, the number 4, the letter U, ACT.org. Also, I've got brochures outside the door here on the table, and my cards are out there on the table as you're leaving too. Any other questions that we can address?
Is there a charge for your service, your organization's services?
No.
So if somebody comes to you and they're in a crisis mode and they need to find a therapist, there's no charge?
Well, if they're in a crisis mode, I mean, we're not like Quick Fix. There